Hey, welcome back. It's week 11 or somewhere around there. Anyway, we're talking about basically some issues connected with genetic testing this week, and we'll talk about some related things next week as well. So this is based to begin in the first half of chapter 9 from the Vaughan text. So some pretty useful information there, good basic kind of background information about the kind of testing in general, kind of factual information, as well as the kinds of ethical issues to which it gives rise. Now, we're going to focus primarily on forms of prenatal genetic testing, basically, just kind of in connection with what we talked about the last couple of weeks. So keep in mind, prenatal could mean different things. It could mean testing in utero. It could also mean in the context of certain forms of assisted reproductive technologies, it could be pre-implantation, basically, where there might be multiple embryos produced. And anyways, the ethical issues don't differ considerably between those cases, so I'll just refer to prenatal genetic testing. So the first reading, other readings, is from Cass again, basically. And as I say, it's kind of on the same wavelength, basically. He's expressing some fairly kind of deep concerns and worries and misgivings about this kind of technology. Some of this kind of is older stuff, and maybe that is partly to do with it. It's a little bit, the science wasn't necessarily so far along, or some of the practices hadn't become, at least some of them, mainstreamed. But in any case, he makes some points that remain completely irrelevant. You may or may not agree. But basically, the deep worries he has generally just when we do, either his focus is on so-called genetic abortion, where a termination of a pregnancy after testing shows that the fetus is indeed has a disabling genetic condition, or in the case of pre-implantation, which wasn't so much a thing at the time he originally wrote this. Either way, basically, he's just saying, well, there are some worrisome implications just in terms of our, well, he puts it, the basic idea of human equality, that is, with regard to disabled people, people who do indeed exist with these sorts of conditions and so on. He thinks, there's this unmistakable message that there's something less valuable or something less worthy about their lives, that there is this message that there is something inherently defective and that it would somehow be better for people like that not to exist. And that's just a terrible message. And surely there's something to what he's saying. Now, I'm not completely sure he's coming at this in quite the same way as like contemporary disability rights advocates would today. It may not make a difference so much. I assume that Cass is deeply concerned, genuinely concerned about people with disabilities and their, how they are perceived and how they are treated and, the kind of equality and respect that ought to be shown. In any case, whether he is or isn't doesn't so much matter. The point he makes is fairly, is significant and worth considering, basically, that somehow there is just inevitably a negative message which has negative implications for sort of, the larger human community, in as much as it does include people with disabilities and these kinds of genetic conditions. The next piece from Purdy, of course, takes a very different line, basically. She's actually contending, quite opposite, that there actually may be a kind of a duty or an obligation precisely to avoid having children with these kinds of genetic conditions, basically. So she really wants to emphasize something, taking procreation very seriously and doing what is possible exactly to avoid having such outcomes, basically. Now, she wants to emphasize, and you can just wonder just whether this is genuine or not. She wants to emphasize, she wants to come at this from, precisely a kind of respect and, taking seriously the idea of equality among all humans. She just thinks that must mean that any potential procreators among us must do what's possible to ensure that at least a minimum kind of health or health and well-being basically is achieved, basically. If there's anything we can do to avoid falling short of that, then we really should do that, and that would mean we ought to do some of the things that Cass, for example, among others, would advise us or strongly say that we should not do. So that's, she's kind of emphasizing that some limitations on procreative liberty, basically, along the lines of what we owe to potential children in terms of their basic, health or basic physical condition. She doesn't so much get into just what form this might take, and that's okay. She's just talking about, moral issues, right? Legal things or actual practical steps. That's a kind of a different issue, basically. We want to think about the moral things first on their own terms. I know that last week virtually every one of you really took issue with the way I phrased something. Now, I did it provocatively on purpose, that is, putting out this idea of the necessity, just this hypothetical idea of needing a permit to procreate. Of course, I never meant this literally. It's never going to happen. Nonetheless, right, the idea is supposed to be that, well, sometimes you perhaps are obliged to prove that certain harms will not happen. And so something like that is at least implicit in Purdy here, that, you could say potential procreators really ought to do what's possible just to make sure that the genetic outcome of procreation is not going to lead to these kinds of outcomes that might fall below what we consider a minimum threshold of healthiness in the potential child, basically. It's not that far-fetched. I mean, again, it may not happen, or it probably wouldn't or anything, but we can certainly think in those terms, that at least in the moral, ethical level of principle, basically, something like that could be required. Finally, then, for this week, an article from McMahon, basically, is closest here to Purdy. And maybe we could put it this way. I mean, McMahon would say that something Purdy is saying is obviously right. That is to say, it's obviously right that we should do what we can to avoid bringing children into existence who would fall below a kind of minimum threshold of healthiness, in that sort of way. Meaning, for McMahon, it's obviously wrong, he thinks, right, to knowingly bring children into existence in that kind of situation. He thinks that's sort of obviously wrong. He's going to try to use that to try to get opponents of genetic testing, typically from the side of, disability advocates and so on, to try to sort of trap them, basically. He wants to say, well, there's something going on here, and it looks like this, to, somebody who is opposed to using genetic testing in order to, say, identify and then possibly stop the birth or the coming into being of children with certain genetic conditions. He thinks if they're opposed to that, then they must at least think that it's okay, that is to say, permissible, to knowingly bring such children into existence. Now, for McMahon, he thinks that's obviously wrong, so he thinks this shows there's something wrong with their argument overall, because it leads to that conclusion, right? It would commit them to the permissibility of knowingly producing disabled children. So the question here, though, I mean, he clearly thinks this is a pretty clever argument, I suppose, but it all rests, of course, on the correctness of that premise, whether or not it is indeed wrong, or at least say obviously wrong, to do that, basically. So I think many people might think that it's actually not necessarily wrong at all. And here you'll see, and we've seen this in previous weeks, although I haven't really touched much on it, what sometimes philosophers call the identity problem. And the idea basically is that when we're thinking in scenarios like this, there is a mistake. There's a kind of fallacy when we imagine that somebody with, say, a certain genetic makeup, which may include a certain genetic disorder of some kind, there's something wrong with sort of imagining that that person, that individual, could have existed without that condition. There is the idea that that condition is part and parcel of who they are, that it's constitutive of their identity, and that when we think that perhaps they could have been born without that condition, what we're really saying is that somebody else, some other child could have been born. So the implication of that line of thought, and this is common among some of the people McMahon is arguing against, or who are arguing against him, is that, well, actually, you can't really harm somebody prenatally. That is to say, before they come into being, right? In the sense that that's whatever, their makeup is at that stage just forms who they are. And there's no real sense in which you could harm them. You could imagine substituting some other person for them, but that's very different than saying you're directly harming them. So McMahon clearly does not believe that view, basically. He is thinking, when he's thinking it is obviously wrong to bring someone into existence with a certain kind of disabling genetic condition, he is, implicitly thinking, in effect anyways, well, that person could have existed without it, basically, that somehow that is causing a harm, and that is why it should be avoided. Whereas, as we're saying, from another perspective, you can say, no, that's just who that person is, and they can have the life that they'll have. You can compare it to other people if you want to, but you can't imagine that person being a different person. So anyway, that's a deep kind of point. You can have that in mind, but just kind of step it back a bit, and really what we have here, we just have McMahon's argument, probably a good one. His argument is fine, right? That is to say that if you are opposed to, say, selectively terminating a certain pregnancy or not implanting certain fetuses because genetic testing reveals a certain condition, he's probably right to say that would mean that it is permissible, it would be permissible to sort of knowingly follow through, say, with a pregnancy, giving birth to a child with that condition. Right? That probably is right. And then it just depends on what you think of that basic premise, whether or not there is something necessarily wrong with that or not, because there may not be. And anyway, that's what we have for discussion this week. Granted, in the case of deafness, nowadays, that's, perhaps not far along on the scale of disability, at least in certain contexts and societies. It is increasingly not necessarily seen even as a disability, let alone a harm. Nonetheless, it's a useful point for discussion to think about that. So have McMahon in mind when you're thinking about that discussion question, basically, just to see what difference is made when you think about that question, at least in that kind of case, what that might mean for his argument here.